I was never the one who dropped the ball and, oh, we lost, because of me. I was never that guy. I was always the hero. But in real life, we don't see ourselves as heroes. David Benner, who's an author and Christian psychologist, says, when I ask people to imagine what God thinks of them, most reply, disappointed. Not heroes, disappointed. Maybe it's because of a low self-esteem. Maybe it's because of some moral failure. Maybe life hasn't turned out the way that we hoped. Or maybe we are living with guilt for some reason. Whatever the reason, most of us don't feel like heroes in real life. That I've been to Dallas Seminary, and my first year at Dallas, back in '94. So it was first year in this big country called America. And I remember waking up one morning in our apartment, which was across the road from the seminary. And I got up, it was 5 a.m. I got up, came outside, turned on the light, and there's a cockroach. Never seen a cockroach before. So I went into the bedroom and woke up my wife and asked her to come and deal with it. That's how cowardly I can be. By the way, I've lived in Australia for 15 years. Cockroaches are nothing now. But David, he'd squash a cockroach with a small finger. He's a hero. He's a hero. And let's see what makes him a hero. Let's see what we can learn from him. And let's see what we can do with this passage in our lives. Firstly, there's 4 points. Firstly, David remembered his calling in verses 1 to 11. David remembered his calling. This is a classic battle scene. You ever seen Braveheart? Mel Gibson in Braveheart. There's two enemies on either side of each other, the English and the Scottish, and there's about 400 to 800 meters of grass in between them, and these two armies are about to go at each other and just slaughter each other to bits. Well, that's kind of the scene here we have in 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Philistines and Israel are two enemies, and they're facing each other, and there's a big stretch of land in between them with a valley down below. Not a Grand Canyon kind of valley, just a valley that you'd find on a farm. They're on two undulating hills, and they're looking at each other, facing off each other, hoping eventually to fight. The thing is that the Philistines have this man called a champion, the text calls him. It's an unusual word, champion, because in the Hebrew, the word is not champion, but literally it's the man between the two. Right? So if you can imagine that, the man between the two. That's who Goliath is. He's the man between the Philistines and Israel. And you've got to get past him before you can get to the Philistines if you're an Israelite. But he's 3 meters tall. He's wearing about 100 kilograms of armor. He's got a bronze javelin slung over his back. He's got a spear. He's intimidating. And he's got his own shield bearer going on ahead of him. Imagine having that job. The guy's impenetrable. In verse 8, it says that Goliath stands there and shouts at Israel, "What do you come out? Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." And then verse 10, he says, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." Did you notice what Saul didn't say? There's no mention of God. He doesn't come out and say, "Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of God?" He doesn't say, "This day I defy the armies of God." In other words, when Saul looks at Israel's army, what does he see? He just sees men. Has anyone in Israel, do you think, bothered to mention to him that he might be the champion of the Philistine army, but Israel has God? Evidently not. Evidently, not one person in Israel's army has bothered to mention this because of their response in verse 11. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the other Israelites, Saul, who was a head and shoulder above the rest of Israel, even him, and the rest of the army were dismayed and terrified. Do you remember why God chose Israel? Do you remember why God called Israel into existence in the first place? God had chosen Israel out of all of the nations to represent Him. The technical or official or biblical term for this is in Exodus 19. They were to be a kingdom of priests. You know what the idea of a priest is? To stand in between. In other words, Israel were to be the ones who would stand in between two. They were to stand in between God and the nations. And their purpose for standing in between the two were to live in such a way in which the other nations would be attracted to their God. They were to live in such a way in which they would demonstrate faith in this God. A couple of scholars say this with regard to Israel's purpose. They were Yahweh, that's another name for God or the Lord, they were Yahweh's poster child. They were a display people, a showcase to the world. In other words, they were to be, this is why they were called to be a giant billboard. You drive along the motorway here in Auckland and you see billboards on the side, and you look up and you see a huge advertisement. That's what Israel were to be. They were to be a billboard, a giant poster to the nations of what God was like. And that the people were to look at Israel and get a picture of what God was like through them. But Israel have forgotten their calling. And the reason they've forgotten brings us to the next point. They'd forgotten God. But not David. David remembered God in verses 12 through to 27. Now our attention is drawn away from the battlefield for a little bit, miles away to a sleepy town called Bethlehem, not to a soldier but to a shepherd boy, David. The connection between David and the Philistines and the Israelite standoff is that David's three oldest brothers are there in the Israelite army. David's the youngest. He's got 7 brothers, and he's the youngest of them. And one day, David's father tells him, I want you to go off to the battlefield. I want you to take some supplies and food to the boys, see how they are, bring me back a report. So David goes up early in the morning, leaves the sheep with another shepherd, goes up to the battlefield. He's all excited when he gets there. He drops his things, runs off. They've just gone off onto the battle line, runs up, says hi to his brothers, finds out how things are going. And just as he does that, Goliath steps out of the Philistine line. And all the Israelites take off. David's left standing there. What's happened? You guys are supposed to be soldiers. And he overhears some of the soldiers say in verse 25, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. And then he hears stuff about the king giving a whole lot of money and his daughter to the man who kills him. David's appalled. Verse 26, he labels Goliath not a champion, but a disgrace. That's what he calls him. Look what he says. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy? Just note that word for a minute. That he should defy the armies of the living God. The armies of Israel can only see one thing. This giant of a man. But not David. David's appalled. This word defy, this is the 3rd time it occurs in this passage. It's occurred in verse 10, verse 25, and it's going to occur again in verse 36 and verse 45. In Psalm 42 verse 10, The person who defies God is the person who says, "Where is your God?" In other words, the person who defies God is the person who thinks that God doesn't exist, that he's irrelevant, that God's as good as dead. But David reminds Israel's army who God is. He's living. He exists. He's not dead. Notice at the beginning of verse 26 who David speaks to. He speaks to the men who are around him. In other words, he's having a bit of a dig. Not too much of a dig because, he's just a young man. He's not a soldier, so he's got to, be a little bit polite. But this is a sideways dig. 40 days Goliath has been acting as though God doesn't exist. But has anyone answered him? Has anyone from Israel stepped up? Has anybody said, "I'll take him on"? Does anyone believe that God is even alive? Evidently not. Which brings us to our third point. In verses 28 to 37, David remembered what real faith is. David remembered what real faith is. The first one is that David remembered his calling. The second point, David remembered his God. And the third point, David remembered what real faith is. Evidently, eventually, Saul hears of David's enthusiasm. David's going on about how he'll take this Goliath on, and he sends for him. "So I hear you think you're a match for this Philistine." And David responds in verse 32, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." To which Saul responds, "You're not able to take this guy on. You're just barely a boy, barely a man, and you're going to fight him. He's been a warrior from his youth. Who do you think you are?" David might not be a soldier, but he's got skill. He says in verse 34, "I've been keeping my father's sheep. Where a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. I've killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine, he'll be like one of them. Because he has," here's the word again, "defied the armies of the living God." David has a track record with God, you see. In verse 37, David says, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." David's experienced God. God is more than just in David's head. He's experienced him firsthand. Now, Saul and Israel's army, they all believe in the same Lord that David does. They believe in the same Lord. But you see, it's only at the level of confession. It's only at the level of head knowledge. In other words, this is what I call a confessional faith. It's a faith in God, but it has no legs to it. It's only in the mind. A confessional faith agrees with the creeds. The creeds that were written in the first 5 centuries of the church that confess who God is. It's where we get some of our theology from. A confessional faith signs the church's statement of faith, which you have. A confessional faith sings the songs. A confessional faith believes in Jesus. But David has more than a confessional faith. He has what I call a functional faith. In other words, David's faith is a functional faith. It functions. You see, functional faith not only confesses faith in God, but it functions like he is God. David lives his life like he actually believes in what he confesses. You see? This is David. His confessional faith, he's got confessional faith. He writes psalms. He sings songs. He prays prayers. He writes things like, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But you see, he's got functional faith. He fights bears and lions. His faith functions. Which brings us to our fourth point, in verses 38 to the rest of the chapter. David remembered what the real battle was all about. So there's four things here, all things that David remembered. David remembered his calling. David remembered his God. David remembered what faith is. David remembered what the real battle is about. Saul hands David a suit of armor, puts on a heavy helmet, gives him a heavy sword. David tries to move. Can't move. Got to be agile when you're fighting, right? You've got to move, you've got to dive, you've got to duck. David can't do any of that. Got to get rid of all of this. So David just takes what he's used to. Arms himself with a shepherd's staff. Goes and picks up 5 stones from the stream, puts them in his shepherd bag that he would use for his lunch and things. And last of all, he takes a sling with him. And he strides off towards Goliath. And Goliath sees David coming. And he sets out with the shield bearer out in front of him. And as David comes more into view, you can just imagine, can't you? If you just imagine the scene, just imagine the whole Philistine army starting to roar with laughter as this David comes on the scene to face this giant of a man. And the text notes that Goliath looks at him and sees that he's young and that he's handsome. In other words, Goliath's thinking, "What, you're sending me a pretty boy? Why send this?" Goliath's insulted. Goliath is just insulted. He says, verse 43, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? Come here and I'll give you your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David's not scared, right? He can squash a cockroach with a small finger. Verse 45, "You come against me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." There's that word again. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I'll give you the carcasses of the Philistines' armies." He's so brave, isn't he? "To the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." While everyone else in Israel is cowering in fear, worried about their own skin, David's only thinking of one thing. How dare this man defame God? How dare he? Notice what Israel's men said. Just go back to verse 25 again for a bit. Just notice what Israel's soldiers said back in verse 25. "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel." Contrast David's words. Goliath hasn't just defied Israel, he's defied God. That's the real point of this battle. That's what's really at stake. David recognizes it. It's not that Goliath is defying Israel, it's that he's defying God. And the whole reason for Israel's existence is to live in such a way in which they reflect God. And it's not happening. David understands the real point of the battle. And so Goliath moves towards David. David runs towards Goliath. David reaches down into his bag, takes out a stone, puts it in a sling. You know how the rest goes. Graham Blakey and I think, just mentioned this recently. Maybe Graham mentioned it to me. But we still remember Chuck Swindoll, Dallas Seminary, his sermon on David and Goliath. And we've got this picture of him, and probably everyone who was there remembers it to this day, like it was 20-something years ago. But he just does all the actions and he sends that stone, and you almost just feel like you can just see it. That's what David does. He sends that stone flying into Goliath's forehead, and he's felled like a tree, thump to the ground. And then he goes and cuts off his head and takes it back. And David's a hero. Gets the girl. Isn't it amazing how in these kind of stories, the guy always gets the girl. And he gets the respect of the entire army. Now I'm supposed to tell you to go out in faith against your Goliaths. Be a hero. But we can only be a hero if we understand what a hero is. And we can only understand what a hero is if we understand the battle. You see, David was the only one who understood the real battle. David was the only one who understood his real calling, Israel's real calling. The battle, the calling to demonstrate that God was the living God. In other words, that all other gods are dead. That's the implication. When you say living God, the implication is all other gods are dead, not worthy of your faith, not worthy of your allegiance, not worthy of your fear. And that's the battle in our lives. You see, the enemy is not what we think. It's so tempting to think the enemy is external circumstances. Have you ever heard Christians say, "Oh, the enemy's attacking me"? You ever heard that? The enemy's attacking me. Now, of course, they mean Satan, don't they? But they're referring to some bad circumstance that has come into their lives. In other words, their Goliath has shown up. "Oh, the enemy's attacking me." But the enemy is not some bad circumstance that has come into our life to make our life miserable. It's not. It's not failure. The enemy is not poverty. The enemy is not sickness. The enemy is not redundancy. The enemy is not misfortune. Don't get me wrong. I'm not wild about any of these things. I'm with C.S. Lewis, who wrote a book on pain, said, "I'd rather crawl through sewage than go through suffering." I would too. But these things are not the enemy. Otherwise, the New Testament wouldn't say, "Consider it pure joy whenever you experience them." We're told what the enemy is. Just a couple of verses from the New Testament. You don't need to turn there. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. "Abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." James chapter 4, verse 1. "What causes fights and quarrels among you?" Talking about the church. "Don't they come from your desires that battle within you?" That's the war. That's the war. Last night, I was out all day yesterday. And, I was hoping to have my sermon done by the time I went out. And I still had stuff to do on it. And last night I got home at about 8 o'clock last night. And my son, my 14-year-old son, had been home all day. And the poor little kid, he hadn't gotten himself dinner. He's capable of getting dinner, but anyway, he didn't get dinner. And I walked in the door. My wife was about probably 5 minutes behind me. She was doing something else. And he said, "Oh, is it just you?" In other words, that was reading between the lines. It was like, "You can't make me dinner." And then he started to say how he hadn't had dinner and stuff. I went straight to my computer, got on my sermon, because I was getting up early to come up here and so forth, and I thought, I just stand up here and have things right, have things good, have things interesting, not boring, and so on and so forth. But I was thinking about that driving up today. I'd forgotten my calling. I'd forgotten my calling. My calling is to preach, but it's not called to preach the best sermon I can possibly preach, is it? But sometimes I forget that. So that's the battle with me. My calling is to be a dad. Right? I'm serious. My calling is to be a dad. My calling is to preach, but my calling isn't to preach sermons that will just be so memorable that you'll just... My calling is to love others, to love your neighbour as yourself. It's so easy to forget our calling. That's the battle, you see. That's the battle that Peter and James are talking about. And so we lose the battle when we idolize things. You understand what I mean by idolize? When we put them in the place of God. When we expect these things to do for us what only God can do. When we put things in that place like money. We expect money to satisfy us or make us happy. When God is or give us life. When God is saying, I'm the one who does that. Or we put possessions in that place, or comfort, or education, or a reputation, or self-image, or the need to be right, or the need to be successful, or to need everything to be under control, or the need to be liked. We could go on and on and on and on and on. Because you can put anything in that place. And when you do, what do? You defy God. You live as though He doesn't exist. You see, the temptation to make an idol out of anything is our greatest enemy. And you can make an idol out of preaching. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. In a nutshell, the real enemy is our tendency to live as though we defy God. To live as though He doesn't exist. And David understood that. We do that when our faith remains a confessional faith, not a functional faith. A.W. Tozer, I bet most of you heard of him. He describes the difference. He doesn't mention these terms, but this is what he's talking about. He describes the difference between confessional faith and functional faith when he says, we have substituted theological ideas, that's confessional faith, for an arresting encounter. We are full of religious notions about God, but our greatest weakness is that for our hearts there is no one there. In other words, in our minds we know about God, but we don't experience Him. And the reason is because our faith is not a functional faith. Paul Tripp says, his pastor, author, used to be a pastor in the United States. He says, danger is afloat when you come to love the ideas of God more than the God whom they represent. That's confessional faith. When we love the ideas about God more than the God they represent. How then do we develop a functional faith? Well, David does offer us a helpful lesson or two. One, we need to build up a track record with God. Trust that God is greater than our idols. Our problem is often fear. I remember talking to a pastor a while ago, and we meet up regularly, and he was telling me how he was having a struggle with managing his time. He was out lots of nights a week and so forth. And so I said, well, can you take off, the time you spend at night, can you take that time off during the day? Spend it, maybe 3 o'clock when your kids get home, spend it with your family. He said, nodded his head. But as we talked, it became evident that, and I couldn't quite work out why can't you do that? Eventually, the problem was, well, if I do that, that means I take away from my preaching preparation. And this is what he said, which means that my sermons might not be as good. It's a common problem we preachers have, right? And then all of a sudden the battle became clear. Do you understand the battle? Do you understand the battle for him? The battle was actually not a management of his time at all. The battle was to be prepared to get up and not having prepared as much as he might have liked for the sermon. The battle was not to make an idol out of his preaching. That was the battle. And I was able to share that with him. Why? Because I've been through the same battle. It could have been me in that story. I could have easily just supplemented some other illustration from my own life. Common one. But you put your own story there, whatever the temptation is. That's the battle. You see, it's so easy to forget our calling. Our calling is not to be successful. Our calling is not to be... In fact, I remember, you might have heard of Howard Hendricks. So he was at Dallas Seminary, a professor of Graham's and mine, Graham Blakey. And I remember the final camp we had in our graduating year. Graham was there, I guess. If you're watching this, Graham, I think you were there. And anyway, so Howard Hendricks gave this illustration. And there was a guy that he knew that was working 3 jobs. It was killing him. He was just, running low on sleep and just burned out and so on and so forth. And Howard Hendricks was talking to him one day and he said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you working 3 jobs?" And you know what the guy said? He said, "I have to survive." Is that fair? Here's what Howard Hendricks says. I've never forgotten. He said, "Who said you had to survive?" It's a fair question, isn't it? Has God called you to survive? Has He? God's called you to be the person in the middle, to reflect His character, to be like Him, to trust in Him. Right? That's who He's called you to be. He hasn't called us to survive. Not in that kind of way. But while David might be... let me just back up a little bit. In order to develop this functional faith, we must look beyond David, though. Because David is part of a bigger story. 1 Samuel, he's within 1 Samuel. The purpose is to demonstrate that David is God's choice for a king. But while David might be a hero on the battlefield, he's not always a hero. You probably know, if you read on in David's story, you'll see murder, you'll see adultery, you'll see father-son issues, you'll see pride. You see, David also needs a hero. That's why 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel are part of a bigger story, God's story. And if we keep moving forward in that story, we'll eventually come to someone who the New Testament calls the Son of David. In other words, he's like David. You might think of him as in the image of David. It's Jesus. Because he too fought an enemy and won with the most unlikeliest of weapons. But he's not only called Son of David, he's called David's Lord, which means that he's greater than David, he's better than David, because the enemy he conquered was greater, the enemy of sin. This is what we all battle with. And how did he do that? By conquering another enemy, the one we all fear, death, the enemy of enemies. Which means that Jesus is the true King. He's the living King. And because he's better than David and greater than David, we must ultimately look not to David, but to him. You see, our idols will never die for us. They'll never be gracious to us. They'll never forgive us. They'll never comfort us when life feels like Goliath. They'll never be near us when we're afraid. We can never talk to our idols. We can never ask them for strength. They will never guarantee us with a future that involves no more tears or no more pain or no more sickness. Only the living God can do that. 2004, I met a man, this is back in Australia, called Bill Ford. He was a missionary in India, and he was a pastor. He came back to Australia. He was a pastor, a respected Bible teacher in the Brethren Church in Australia, and he was often asked to speak at conferences, in demand, very much in demand, and if you're in the Brethren Church in Australia, you know Bill Ford. And he came to see me one day in May 2005 when I had just resigned from a pastoral position that I was in Australia. We'd been in Australia just over 2 years. We were looking to come back to New Zealand. And he came down to see me and said that he'd been praying for someone to take his place for the last 6 months. And he thought for some reason that I was the man to do it, which I did. And a year later, he came to the elders and told us that his wife had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Today, his wife, so it's 15 years ago. Today, his wife Gladys, is still alive, but she can't walk, she can't talk, she can't eat, she can't even move. Bill has looked after her for nearly 15 years, and as a result, he's taken less and less ministry engagements. He's given up everything. His whole life has changed. He's my hero. 2013, a video was made of Bill and Glad Ford entitled What is Love? I was actually going to show it, but I won't for the sake of time, but you can watch it. What is Love? Bill Forward. If you look up that, you'll find it. It's had nearly 3 million views on YouTube. He and his wife featured on 60 Minutes in Australia back in 2013, I think it was. In the video, Bill says, I am determined to care for her every need. Her every need. I saw Bill in February 2018. I've seen him since. And he said to me, and this was, I won't tell you too much context, but this background here is that I was really struggling with what my calling was. And he said, and I was in his lounge, and he stood up, and he walked off towards his bedroom, and he said, come with me. I want to show you what the Lord has called me to. And I followed him into his bedroom where his wife lay motionless on the bed. He lifted her up. He took her to the bathroom, bathed her, dressed her, combed her hair, fed her breakfast, brushed her teeth, did everything for her from the time he woke her up in the morning to the time he put her to bed at night. He said to me, the day I found out that she had Alzheimer's was the day I died. What he meant by that was when the day he found out she had Alzheimer's was the day that he remembered his calling. That he remembered what the real battle was. That he remembered where true life was to be found. It was not in his accomplishments. It was not in his ministry. It was in his God. Living God. He says this at the end of his video. I really encourage you to go and see it, to see the video on YouTube. God has loved us so unconditionally, and I understand that God has put his love in my heart. And because I realize how much God has loved me, that's how I can too love my lovely wife. She has done so much for me over all these years. Now she can't, but I can. And I can return her love. And it's a love that means I can do everything for her. He's my hero because of this. Because he understands his calling. He understands what real faith is. It's not just a confessional faith. It's a functional faith. It's interesting. I just heard this secondhand, but someone was visiting our church one day, this back in Budrum on the Sunshine Coast, where I was a teaching pastor and Bill was there. And someone said to someone in our church afterwards, she said, I just saw the face of God this morning. There was this gentleman in the front row and he turned round I can't tell you any more than what I just heard, but she said, I just saw the face of God. And what she was describing was, I just saw the presence of God, and it was Bill Ford. That's what Israel were meant to be. Someone who stood in between God and others to reflect the presence of God. David knew it. He understood what the real battle was. That's our real battle. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your grace and your love and your kindness and your mercy. We thank you for life. We thank you that you're a living God in Christ, raised from the dead. We thank you that he reigns at your right hand, that he is God, and that he lives to intercede for us. Father, help us to remember what the battle is day after day after day as war is waged against our souls. Please bless this church. Bless the church as two become one, what they already are in the heavenly realms. And Father, help them to embrace that, to understand their calling, to understand that you are alive, to understand what real faith is all about, and to understand where the real battle is. In Jesus' name, amen.